I love how in your work you mix science, history, anthropology, and mythology, and they all interpenetrate each other and confuse these limitations of what you call Europatriarchal knowledge. How these figures that you've given us, and then these collective groups of women who have this knowledge of the color blue and how to make it, represent power that is outside of the colonized conflation of power with violence and aggression and dominance. That there's a very different type of power that we're seeing here. And you've developed an actual term for this. And I was wondering if you could talk about Oya and talk about exusions and how there is a way to wield power. And this goes back to the session we just had, which is, it's not about humans being passive and being meek. There's a way to wield power correctly or ethically.
A rich question. Thank you. I think it is really important to me, that sort of synergy and synthesis of different fields. And it's important to me as a disruption of knowledge production and a kind of reinventing and reimagining a value system that's based on feminist values. So much of patriarchal, what I indeed call Europatriarchal knowledge production, it sort of stems from this idea of there being a kind of Platonic, transcendental, better than the earth realm. So in whether we're talking about religions or mythologies or science, so much of Europatriarchal knowledge production is rooted in this idea that what we have here on earth is not the ideal. It's not good enough. And there's this other plane, other place somewhere that we are transcending toward. And in my view, a feminist value system really challenges that and sort of says that actually all of those qualities exist on earth, and the sort of plurality and diversity and earthliness and wildness that myth can draw from that. We don't need to have this Platonic view. And so my combining and synthesizing science with anthropology, with feminist theory and African philosophy is very much ultimately aiming to challenge, and not just a challenge, but to actually reveal how so much of Europatriarchal knowledge is a deception and a delusion. We're being educated in ways that deceive us, not always because they are intentionally setting out to deceive us, but because they're incomplete. And maybe it's worth mentioning that in my book and in my work, when I explore Europatriarchal knowledge, it's not so much to sort of critique Eurocentricity or male centricity, that's inherent, but rather it is to really understand what is it that Europatriarchal knowledge does to the mind and to the body and to the soul. And what it does is create this very mechanic, machine-like, rigid form of knowing. The synthesis is about giving a fuller and a truer perspective of reality. In the process of doing that, whatever sort of histories I have been researching or I discuss with people or whatever, it sort of automatically lends itself to more holistic and what I call sensuous knowledge, tactics or approaches. And so with that preamble, Oya, and from Oyalogy, which is what you had read of an essay of mine, Oya is the Yoruba goddess of thunder. And she sees over the domain of death, of transformation, also of fury and things like that. And I see her first and foremost as a kind of, she represents a kind of feminist deity that troubles the patriarchy and that troubles anything that is oppressive. But actually, in some of my recent research, I've come across primarily the work of a Nigerian feminist philosopher called Sophie Oluwole. And she actually argues that Oya is based on a real person who actually lived, a woman who disrupted so much. And so she became a kind of feminist deity for other women and some men, of course, as well. Until today, there's festivals for Oya where men have to dress as women. So they kind of dress as though they embody her, and the women kind of stare the ritual that then takes place. And so, yes, I was compelled to write that essay and also the part of my book that I read, and I'll speak about exusions in a second. But all of these kind of poetic approaches is my attempt in creating a language that one sort of ends these deceptions and delusions that I mentioned of Europatriarchal knowledge. But I think a lot of feminist work has been doing that for decades, trying to end the deception and the delusion. But what I wanted to do was, in addition to that, to simultaneously create a language that is sort of psychoactive or something that really affects us psychologically, and therefore can help in switching on this kind of light bulb. So you have an aha moment of, this is something that I can connect with. And what I heard, I joined at the very end of the last session, but that precise thing of wildness being something that you can actually do, and it being something active. I wanted to write in a way that's both politically relevant and polemical in a sense, but that's also psychologically activating. And in that realm, I think we have this sort of, I guess, Jungian archetypes and a lot of psychoanalytical language that has to do with myth, with things that affect the senses, colors and natural elements. So exusions is a sort of continuation of oyalogy, certainly inspired by the mindset. And that came to me precisely because I was working on a chapter in my book, which is about power. And in some sense, all of my work is about power. If I had to choose one topic that I'm always sort of engaged with, it's power. And so I was working on this chapter. It was possibly the favorite one for me. And so I was really languorously lingering with it, working very slowly. And I was also traveling a lot at the time and going through a challenging period in life that involved a lot of grief. So I would go to rivers. So my sort of Yoruba deity is Yemoja. She is the goddess of the seas, of the oceans, of any sort of water bodies. And so whenever I travel, the first thing that I do is find the sort of the nearest, if nothing else is available, or if I don't have time to go further out, water body, and specifically rivers. I feel a calling toward rivers. And so I was spending a lot of time going to rivers, and I sort of became obsessed with what rivers were helping me to feel. So I would also come back home and watch hours of river videos on YouTube, of which there are surprisingly many, I must say. People just film a river for hours and hours and hours. And while I was writing the chapter about power, I had read about this ancient Greek term for power, which is exousia. And it just came from somewhere. This word, exusions, came to describe what ultimately was what the rivers taught me about power. And it felt really that kind of aha moment when I realized that there was a synergy between spending all the time by the rivers and my writing the chapter, and that the rivers were actually able to communicate, or I was able to extrapolate through observation, something that I'd been trying to understand for over a decade about power, which was the sort of reciprocity and kind of a natural flow that power has and how it emanates from within. And that really showed me that there's alternative ways of describing power, because as you said in the question, and something that I write about in the book, is we still, even within progressive movements, the ones I'm specifically involved with, which are the feminist movement and the Black liberation struggles, we talk so much about power, transforming it, but we are also using very often the same language about power, in which power is made synonymous with things like coercion and violence and authority, which means that on some level we continue to reproduce and validate that type of power. So exusions came from a desire to reimagine what power can be.